Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and let the weight of the day begin to settle around you like a heavy winter blanket drawn up slowly, carefully, with great tenderness, over your shoulders and across your chest. Let your breathing slow, just a little. Let the muscles along the back of your neck release their gentle hold. There is nothing that needs doing right now. There is nowhere you are required to be. There is only this voice, and the soft drift of history, and the quiet place inside you that knows how to rest. Tonight, we are going to travel back together, back through the decades, back through the amber light of memory, to a place that was once very ordinary and very familiar, a city of wide shoulders and long avenues and corner drugstores where the fluorescent lights hummed softly above the aspirin and the antacids and the small amber bottles of pain relief that lined the shelves in tidy, reassuring rows. We are going back to the city of Chicago, to the autumn of 1982, when the leaves had just begun to turn, and the air carried the first cool suggestion of the coming winter. And we are going to move slowly through that time together, the way a river moves through a plain, without urgency, without drama, finding each bend as it comes and following it gently downstream. If this voice helps you rest, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake, only if the words have not yet carried you somewhere warm and quiet and far away. And now, let us begin. Let us drift backward, together, into the autumn of 1982. It was a Tuesday morning, the 28th day of September, in the year 1982, and in the suburb of Elk Grove Village, Illinois. A 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman woke before the school day had properly begun, already feeling unwell, already sensing that something in her body was not quite right. She padded to her parents, as children do, and told them that her throat was sore and her nose was running, that she did not feel ready for school. And her parents, as parents do, sought the most ordinary of remedies, the kind of remedy that sat in medicine cabinets all across America, in every kitchen and bathroom and bedside drawer of that era. They gave her a single capsule of extra-strength Tylenol, the red and white capsule that was, in those days, one of the most trusted over-the-counter medications in the United States, sold by the tens of millions, manufactured by McNeil Consumer Products, a subsidiary of the great healthcare company Johnson & Johnson, and regarded by doctors and parents, and working men and women alike, as a safe and reliable tool against everyday pain and discomfort. Mary swallowed the capsule, and her parents returned to their morning routines, and the house settled into its ordinary quiet. Within a few hours, Mary Kellerman was gone. The cause would not be immediately understood, not at first, not in those early hours of that autumn morning, when grief arrived before any explanation could, when her parents could do nothing but hold the fact of it, heavy and incomprehensible, in the stunned stillness of a house that had been entirely ordinary just a short while before. Medical personnel arrived, and the familiar procedures of emergency response began, though they would ultimately prove insufficient against something none of them yet knew they were facing. Mary Kellerman was the first, though no one yet knew there would be others, and no one yet knew what had been placed inside that small, innocent-looking capsule she had taken for a sore throat on a cool autumn morning in a quiet Illinois suburb. The world continued around her family's grief, the school buses running their routes, the neighbors going about their days, the leaves turning slowly in the yards along her street, entirely unaware that something of consequence had just entered the world. That same day, a few miles away in the suburb of Arlington Heights, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus came home from work and, feeling unwell, took 2 capsules of extra-strength Tylenol. He collapsed later that day and was taken to Northwest Community Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The medical staff initially uncertain of the cause, looking toward the heart and the blood and the ordinary mechanisms of sudden death, not yet thinking of the small bottle on his kitchen counter or the capsules that remained inside it. Adam Janus had been a young man, healthy by most appearances, and the swiftness of his death was bewildering to those who had known him, to his colleagues at the Postal Service, and to his family who gathered that evening in his home in Arlington Heights to mourn him, to sit together in the particular and heavy silence that falls over a family in the first hours after an unexpected death. Among those who came were his younger brother, Stanley Janus, 25 years old, and Stanley's wife, Teresa, who was 19 and who had been married to Stanley for only a short time, and who sat now in her brother-in-law's home with the future still stretching out before her, still believing in the ordinary continuity of days. Stanley and Teresa, complaining of headaches in the midst of their grief, reached for the bottle of Tylenol that sat in the home of the man they had just lost. It was a gesture so natural, so unremarkable, so entirely consistent with the small ordinary ways that people manage discomfort, that no one would have thought to stop them. They each took capsules from Adam's bottle. Within hours, both Stanley and Teresa Janus collapsed. Stanley died that evening. Teresa Janus lingered briefly, and then she too was gone. 3 members of a single family taken within the span of a single day, their deaths connected by a bottle, by a tragedy still not yet understood, still not yet named. It was Nurse Helen Jensen, Arlington Heights' only public health official, who first began to draw the threads together, who first looked at the facts laid before her, and felt, in the careful and methodical way of someone trained to notice patterns, that something was not quite right. She had been asked to look into the deaths of the Janus family, and when she visited Adam Janus's home, she noticed the bottle of Tylenol on the counter, and she noticed that 6 capsules had been removed from it, and something in the quietness of that observation made her pause. She turned the bottle over to an investigator named Nick Pichos, and Pichos, following a thread of careful professional instinct, contacted Edmund R. Donohue, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for Cook County, who listened to the details and, drawing on his knowledge of how poisons behave in the body, asked Pichos to smell the bottle. When Pichos detected what Donohue had suspected he might detect, an odor faintly reminiscent of almonds, a scent associated in the literature of toxicology with a particular class of compounds, Donohue asked the county's chief toxicologist, Michael Schaffer, to test the remaining capsules. Schaffer and his team worked through their analysis, and what they found was devastating in its clarity. 4 of the 44 remaining capsules in that bottle contained potassium cyanide, and not merely a trace of it, but nearly 3 times the dose required to kill a human being. Enough poison to have killed thousands. A press conference was held, and the public was advised, in that careful and measured language of official crisis communication, not to take Tylenol for the time being. The city of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs began, slowly, and then all at once, to understand that something unprecedented had entered their world. Something that had come through the most ordinary of channels, the neighborhood drugstore, the kitchen medicine cabinet, the reflex of reaching for pain relief. By chance, and by the careful inventory habits of the paramedics who had attended to Mary Kellerman on that first morning, the bottle from which she had taken her capsule had been preserved. Investigators found, comparing the lot numbers printed on the bottles, that the Kellerman bottle and the Janus bottle had come from the same production lot, designated MC2880, and Johnson & Johnson moved quickly to issue a recall for all Tylenol from that lot. But the investigation was still unfolding, still accumulating its quiet and terrible evidence. And when tainted bottles from entirely different lots were discovered, including the pills that had been in the possession of another victim, Mary McFarland, traced to lots designated 1910, MD, and MB 2738, it became clear that the contamination was not confined to a single batch, not the result of a single moment in the manufacturing process, but something broader, something deliberate and distributed. The recall expanded, widening outward to cover any bottle of extra-strength Tylenol capsules purchased anywhere in the Chicago area, and it became, by the scale of its scope, one of the largest pharmaceutical recalls the United States had ever seen. Meanwhile, 3 more people were dying. Mary McFarland, 31 years old, died in Elmhurst after taking capsules purchased at an Osco drugstore in Schaumburg. Paula Prince, 35 years old, a flight attendant who lived in Chicago, had purchased a bottle at a Walgreens on North Wells Street and was found dead in her apartment. Mary Reiner, 27 years old, and a mother who had recently given birth to her 4th child, died in Winfield after taking capsules purchased at Frank's Finer Foods. 7 people, across the span of just a few days, taken by the same quiet and invisible means. In the hours and days that followed the public announcement, Chicago moved into a state of collective alertness that had something of the quality of a dream, of that particular unease that settles over a place when something familiar has been revealed as dangerous. Chicago Police Department patrol cars drove slowly through residential streets, their loudspeakers broadcasting warnings to residents not to take Tylenol, the amplified voice drifting across front yards and through open windows into living rooms where families sat, perhaps holding bottles they had not yet touched, perhaps already reaching for the phone to call poison control. Hospitals across the metropolitan area were inundated with people who had taken Tylenol recently and now feared the worst, presenting with anxiety and uncertainty, and the profound helplessness of not knowing, and medical staff worked through long shifts to assess and reassure and monitor. More than 270 separate incidents of product tampering were reported across the country in the month that followed the Chicago deaths as the news spread and copycat events multiplied. Pills tainted with substances ranging from rat poison to hydrochloric acid turning up in stores in states far removed from Illinois. The Food and Drug Administration tallied these incidents with the meticulous patience of an agency confronting something entirely new, something for which its existing frameworks were not quite adequate, and the pharmaceutical industry watched and waited and began to reckon with a vulnerability in its systems that had previously gone unimagined. Mayor Jane Byrne, working with local law enforcement and health officials and the laboratories of area universities, ordered all Tylenol products removed from the shelves of Chicago's grocers and pharmacies and sent for testing, an operation that required coordination on a scale that stretched every available resource. It was the kind of civic response that cities rarely need to mount, and that this one mounted with a thoroughness born of genuine alarm in that quiet way that institutions sometimes rise to their best selves in the face of something larger than ordinary experience. The tainted capsules, when investigators examined them with the full resources of forensic science available in 1982, revealed a pattern that was both clear and deeply troubling in its implications. The manufacturing records showed that the contaminated bottles had come from 2 different production facilities, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas. And this simple fact was of enormous significance because it meant that the cyanide could not have been introduced during the manufacturing process itself. Someone had taken bottles from store shelves in the Chicago area, opened them with a care that left no obvious external evidence of disturbance, removed capsules, separated the two halves of each capsule, replaced the white acetaminophen powder inside with potassium cyanide, reassembled the capsule, and returned the bottles to the shelves, where they waited in their ordinary-looking rows for an unsuspecting customer to reach for them. The investigation that followed was a multi-agency effort of considerable complexity, drawing in the Chicago Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Food and Drug Administration, and the resources of Cook County's medical and forensic apparatus, all of them working across jurisdictions and toward a single question that, even with all of their combined expertise and effort, would prove deeply resistant to a clear answer. A surveillance photograph was recovered from a Walgreens drugstore on North Wells Street in Chicago, showing Paula Prince at the moment she purchased the bottle of Tylenol that would take her life. And in the photograph, just a few feet behind her, stood a bearded man whose face the camera had captured in a moment of terrible proximity to tragedy. Police released the photograph and asked the public for help in identifying the man. And tips arrived, as they tend to in the wake of publicized appeals, in large and uneven quantities, each one requiring assessment, each one representing a small expenditure of investigative time and attention. The city moved slowly through its grief and its unease, autumn deepening around it, the leaves falling in the parks and along the residential streets, the ordinary world continuing with all its ordinary textures, even as something extraordinary and unresolved remained at the center of it. Potassium cyanide, the substance that had been placed inside those capsules, is a compound with a history stretching back through the centuries of human engagement with chemistry and industry, and, in darker chapters, with methods of harm. It belongs to the class of compounds known as cyanide salts, and its action within the human body is both swift and thorough, interfering with the abilities of cells to use oxygen, a process that physicians and toxicologists describe as cellular asphyxiation, the body's tissues starved of the oxygen that the blood continues to carry to them. The machinery of life, interrupted at its most fundamental level. In the medical understanding of 1982, the treatment options for acute cyanide poisoning were limited, and the speed with which the compound acted meant that the window for intervention was extremely narrow, a matter of minutes rather than hours. And in the cases of the Chicago victims, by the time the nature of the poisoning was understood, that window had long since closed. A fatal dose of potassium cyanide in a human adult is generally considered to be somewhere in the range of 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and the capsules recovered from the Chicago bottles contained quantities that far exceeded this threshold, meaning that any single capsule, taken by any person of any size or constitution, would have been sufficient to cause death within the time frame observed. The compound itself has a faint odor, sometimes described as resembling bitter almonds, a characteristic scent produced by the release of hydrogen cyanide gas, and it was this odor that Deputy Medical Examiner Donoghue suspected and Investigator Pichos confirmed when he was asked to smell the Janus bottle. In clinical terms, the symptoms of acute cyanide poisoning progress rapidly, beginning with a sense of disorientation and weakness, followed by a loss of consciousness, and then, in the absence of intervention, a cessation of the vital functions, all of this occurring with a swiftness that, in the autumn of 1982, left the physicians who attended the victims with little opportunity to understand what they were seeing before it had already concluded. It is worth noting, for the purposes of understanding the particular horror that settled over the Chicago metropolitan area in those days, that the victims would have had no warning, no reason to suspect that the capsule they took was anything other than what it appeared to be. Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of McNeil Consumer Products, the manufacturer of Tylenol, found itself in the autumn of 1982 at the center of a crisis for which no corporation had previously needed to prepare, confronting a situation that its legal counsel and public relations teams and executive leadership had to navigate without the benefit of precedent, in real time, with the eyes of the nation and the scrutiny of federal regulatory agencies fully upon them. The company's response in those early days of October 1982 was shaped significantly by a man named James Burke, who served as the chief executive officer of Johnson & Johnson, and who made a series of decisions that would be studied and discussed in business, schools, and public relations programs for decades to come. Burke's approach, as those who worked with him would later describe it, was grounded in a document called the Johnson & Johnson Credo, a statement of values written by the company's founder, Robert Wood Johnson II, in 1943, which placed the company's obligations to the public and to consumers ahead of its obligations to shareholders, a hierarchy of priority that was unusual in corporate culture even then. And that would prove, in the crisis of 1982, to be an unexpectedly useful moral framework. On October 5th, 1982, Johnson & Johnson issued a nationwide recall of all extra-strength Tylenol capsule products, not merely the Chicago area products, not merely the lots that had been found to be contaminated, but every bottle of extra-strength Tylenol capsules in circulation. Across the entire country, an estimated 31 million bottles, with a retail value of more than $100 million. The company halted Tylenol production. It halted Tylenol advertising. It distributed warnings to hospitals and distributors, and offered to exchange all capsule products already in the hands of the public for solid tablets. It was, by the accounting of the financial press of that era, a decision that cost the company an extraordinary sum, and that temporarily collapsed Tylenol's market share from approximately 35% of the over-the-counter analgesic market to approximately 8%. And yet it was this very willingness to absorb that cost, to place the safety of the public above the financial interests of the company, that would eventually form the basis of the positive regard in which Johnson & Johnson's crisis response came to be held. The public relations dimensions of Johnson & Johnson's response were themselves a kind of landmark in the history of corporate communication, a case study that public relations professionals and crisis management specialists would return to repeatedly in the years and decades that followed, citing it as an example of a company that had done, under conditions of enormous pressure and uncertainty, something genuinely admirable. The Washington Post, in an article published in the days following the recall, observed that Johnson & Johnson had effectively demonstrated how a major business ought to handle a disaster, and contrasted it favorably with other corporate crises of the era in which the company's response had compounded the original incident rather than containing it. The public relations strategy that guided Johnson & Johnson's communications in the autumn of 1982 is credited chiefly to Harold Burson, a public relations executive whose counsel shaped the company's tone and messaging during those weeks, and whose approach emphasized transparency, speed, and a genuine prioritization of public safety over reputational management. In November of 1982, just weeks after the recall, Johnson & Johnson reintroduced Tylenol capsules in a new packaging format, a triple-sealed design that used a foil seal over the bottle mouth, a plastic seal around the bottle cap, and a printed seal across the box itself, making it visually apparent to any consumer whether the product had been tampered with before purchase. This reintroduction was accompanied by substantial price promotions and a marketing campaign that sought to reassure the public that the company had taken the lessons of the crisis seriously and had acted on them with thoroughness and sincerity. The recovery of Tylenol's market share in the months and years following the recall, rising back to its position as the best-selling over-the-counter analgesic in the United States, is generally attributed to this combination of decisive action, transparent communication, and the introduction of tamper-evident packaging that gave consumers a visible mechanisms for trust. It was a kind of corporate restoration story that played out against the backdrop of an unsolved crime, a story of an institution finding its footing in the aftermath of a disaster it had not caused and could not have anticipated, moving forward with the particular gravity of an organization that understands it carries the weight of other people's trust. During this period, as Johnson & Johnson managed its crisis response, and investigators worked through the evidence, the question of who had done this settled over the city of Chicago like a cold autumn fog, present everywhere and yielding nothing clear. The investigation had established, with reasonable certainty, the method. The bottles had been purchased from retail stores in the Chicago area, tampered with, to introduce potassium cyanide into some of the capsules, and then returned to the store shelves in a manner designed to avoid detection, a process that required a certain patience and a certain deliberateness, a willingness to handle poison and reassemble capsules with enough care to leave no visible evidence of disturbance. The multi-agency task force, assembled to investigate the murders, moved through the available evidence with the systematic patience of investigators who know that a case of this nature will not be resolved quickly, that it will require the accumulation of many small facts and the careful testing of many theories before anything approaching clarity begins to emerge. A surveillance photograph from the Walgreens on North Wells Street captured Paula Prince in the final ordinary moment of her life, at the checkout counter, and behind her stood a bearded man whose identity could not be immediately established, and who became, for a time, one of the focal points of investigative attention as police distributed the image and sought information from the public about who he might be. Tips came in from across the country, as they do in the wake of widely publicized crimes, some of them earnest and some of them confused, and some of them sent by people whose own circumstances or grievances had led them to this dark edge of civic participation, each tip requiring the expenditure of investigative time before it could be assessed and either pursued or set aside. It was, in the parlance of the law enforcement community, a cold and difficult case from its earliest days. A case without witnesses, without forensic evidence of the kind that could immediately establish an identity, without the usual landmarks that guide an investigation toward its resolution. And then, in October of 1982, a letter arrived. The letter arrived at the offices of Johnson & Johnson sometime in October of 1982, and it was addressed in a manner that suggested its author had given its presentation some thought, and what it said was brief and direct and deeply alarming. The author claimed responsibility for the Chicago Tylenol murders and offered to stop the killings in exchange for $1 million deposited in a specific bank account. The letter had been sent by a man named James William Lewis, who was also known by the alias Robert Richardson, and who was living in New York City at the time, and who had a past that investigators, once they had identified him, found to be layered with complexity and shadow. Lewis was located and arrested, and when investigators spoke with him, he did not deny writing the letter, acknowledging that he had worked on it for 3 days, though he told authorities that the letter's claim of responsibility was false, that he had written it for reasons that, as his attorneys would later explain in court, related to drawing attention to the former employer of his wife, rather than to any actual involvement in the murders. He was tried not for the murders themselves, for which prosecutors determined they did not have sufficient evidence to charge him, but for extortion, for the act of demanding money through a threat. And he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, a sentence he served before his eventual release. But the question of James Lewis and his relationship to the Chicago Tylenol murders did not settle into simple resolution with his conviction for extortion, and would continue to be revisited by investigators and by those who followed the case for the decades that followed, because certain details, as they emerged over time, kept the question alive. A postmark on the letter, examined carefully in 2007, indicated that it had been sent on October 1st, 1982, and if Lewis's own account of having worked on the letter for 3 days was accurate, then he would have begun writing it before the murders had even been reported in the news. A detail that, when it was brought to Lewis's attention, caused him to recant the timeline he had previously offered. Lewis died on July 9th, 2023, at the age of 76, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, having never been charged with the murders, and having continued to deny his involvement in them for the remaining 4 decades of his life. The second man who came to investigators' attention during the course of the inquiry was named Roger Arnold, and he was, in the geography of the case, someone whose life had intersected with the circumstances of the murders in ways that seemed, to those examining the evidence, to merit serious attention. Arnold worked as a dock worker at a Jewel Osco store in Melrose Park, Illinois, and he had told police at some point that he was in possession of potassium cyanide, the very substance that had been used in the capsules, which was not the kind of fact that one could simply set aside in the context of an investigation of this nature. The owner of a bar that Arnold frequented regularly, a man named Marty Sinclair, had reported Arnold to the police, describing how Arnold had spoken about killing people with a white powder and had become increasingly erratic as his marriage dissolved around him. And this too was the kind of information that warranted careful attention. A copy of a book called The Poor Man's James Bond was found in Arnold's home, and among the information contained within it were instructions for the preparation of potassium cyanide. And when considered alongside everything else that investigators had gathered, this detail added another layer to the accumulating picture. Arnold had also worked, at some point in his employment history, alongside the father of one of the victims, Mary Reiner, at a warehouse, and his wife had received medical treatment at a hospital located across the street from the store where Reiner had purchased the tainted Tylenol. Arnold was detained by police on several occasions during the course of the investigation, and each time, the evidence fell short of what was required to support a charge, and he was released. The story of Roger Arnold took a deeply sorrowful turn in the summer of 1983, when he mistook a man named John Stanisha, a computer consultant and father of 3, who was leaving a bar with friends, for Marty Sinclair, the man who had reported him to police and shot and killed him. Arnold was convicted of that murder in January of 1984 and served 15 years of a 30-year sentence. In 2010, long after his death in June of 2008, Arnold's body was exhumed so that DNA samples could be taken from his remains and compared against samples recovered from the tainted bottles. His DNA did not match. The autumn of 1982 passed into winter, and with it came the accumulation of those secondary effects that a crime of such unprecedented nature casts outward into the culture the way a stone dropped into still water sends its rings to the far edge of the pond. Halloween arrived in late October, in the middle of the crisis, and many communities across the Chicago area and beyond made the decision to discourage or limit traditional trick-or-treating activities, the familiar rituals of children in costumes moving from door to door, suddenly freighted with the anxiety of a public that had just learned that ordinary packaged consumer goods could carry within them something invisible and lethal. Candy sales across American grocery stores declined by more than 20% in the period immediately surrounding Halloween of 1982, a measurable economic reflection of a cultural mood, a fear so deeply felt that it expressed itself in the choices people made in the aisles of supermarkets on ordinary October afternoons. The more than 270 copycat incidents reported by the Food and Drug Administration in the weeks following the Chicago deaths extended the unease well beyond Illinois, touching communities in states far distant from the original events, and the pharmaceutical and food industries found themselves confronted with a new and specific vulnerability that they had not previously needed to design against. Companies pulled products from shelves, issued warnings, hired security consultants, and began the long process of redesigning their packaging to incorporate features that would make tampering both more difficult and more visible, working quickly because the commercial pressure to do so was immense, and the reputational consequences of being associated with even a single copycat incident were understood to be severe. In the American home, medicine cabinets became the sites of a new and quiet attentiveness, a habit of checking and examining and inspecting that had not existed before September of 1982, a small but permanent alteration in the texture of ordinary domestic life. It is worth reflecting from the distance of the years that have since elapsed on how thoroughly and how swiftly a single series of events can alter the relationship between a society and the most ordinary objects of its daily life, on how the presence of the familiar can suddenly require a new kind of attention, a new kind of care that once established does not recede. In Washington, in the offices of the Congress of the United States, and in the regulatory agencies that govern the safety of food and pharmaceutical products, the Chicago Tylenol murders prompted a legislative and regulatory response that would, over the months and years that followed, fundamentally reshape the landscape of consumer product safety in America. The response was not immediate in all its forms, for the machinery of legislation moves with a measured deliberateness that reflects the complexity of the interests involved, but the direction was clear from the early days of the crisis, and the pressure from the public and from the press was consistent and insistent. In 1983, the United States Congress passed legislation that came to be known informally as the Tylenol Bill, which established product tampering as a federal felony, creating criminal penalties of a severity commensurate with the gravity of the offense, and providing law enforcement agencies with a legal framework that had not previously existed for the prosecution of crimes of this specific nature. The Food and Drug Administration, for its part, moved to update its regulations governing the packaging of over-the-counter medications, working through the process of public comment and regulatory review that its charter required, and eventually, in 1989, issuing regulations that mandated tamper-evident features on all over-the-counter medications sold in the United States, a requirement that applied to every manufacturer, every product, every package, without exception. The pharmaceutical industry, even ahead of the formal regulatory requirements, had already begun the process of redesigning its products, moving away from powder-filled capsules, which were recognized as particularly vulnerable to the kind of tampering that had occurred in Chicago, towards solid tablets and toward the form that would come to be called the caplet, a solid tablet shaped to resemble a capsule, which offered the swallowing ease of a capsule without the separable two-piece construction that had made capsules so accessible to a person with harmful intentions. These changes were expensive, and they required significant investment in new equipment and new processes, and they added cost to products that had previously been manufactured within tighter margins, and yet the industry undertook them because the alternative, the continuation of a vulnerability that had been so dramatically exposed, was understood to be untenable in both ethical and commercial terms. Over the next several years, the foil seal and the plastic wrap and the printed outer box became the standard elements of over-the-counter medication packaging across the United States, each one a quiet and permanent memorial to the 7 people who died in the Chicago suburbs in the autumn of 1982. Within the broader history of public health and consumer safety in the United States, the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders occupy a place of particular significance, not because they were the largest loss of life from a single event of this type, but because of the specificity and swiftness of the transformation they produced, the clarity with which they illuminated a previously unconsidered vulnerability, and the degree to which the response to them established patterns of practice and precedent that endure to the present day. The story of these events sits at the intersection of several important narratives in American life: the narrative of consumer safety and the evolution of the regulatory state, the narrative of corporate responsibility and the obligations of large institutions to the people they serve, the narrative of forensic investigation and its possibilities and limitations, and the quieter and more personal narrative of ordinary people whose ordinary days were interrupted by something they could not have anticipated and against which they had no defense. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. Adam Janus was 27. Stanley Janus was 25. Teresa Janus was 19. Mary McFarland was 31. Paula Prince was 35. Mary Reiner was 27 and had just welcomed her 4th child into the world. These are the facts of their ages and their circumstances, offered here not for the purpose of dramatization, but as the kind of simple grounding in human reality that the historical record requires, the recognition that the events being described were not abstract, not hypothetical, not merely regulatory or investigative in their significance, but deeply and irreversibly personal. The lives of those 7 people, and the lives of everyone who loved them, were changed permanently in the autumn of 1982. And that permanence is itself a kind of fact that history must carry forward carefully with the same attention and the same respect that one brings to the rest of the record. Meanwhile, in the years and decades ahead, the investigation would continue. New technologies would be brought to bear on old evidence. New suspects would be examined and set aside. And the question at the center of everything would remain, quietly and persistently, unanswered. The first months of 1983 brought a continuation of the investigative effort, and with them came the early signs of that patient institutional rhythm that characterizes a major unsolved case as it settles into the long middle of its history. The phase after the initial urgency has subsided and the daily press coverage has thinned, the phase in which investigators continue their work with a thoroughness that is less visible to the public, but no less real. The Federal Bureau of Investigation remained deeply involved, its agents working alongside Chicago Police Department detectives and the resources of the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, maintaining the multi-agency structure that had been assembled in the immediate aftermath of the murders. In early 1983, FBI criminal analyst John Douglas, whose work in the area of criminal profiling had made him one of the more prominent figures in the forensic science of that era, proposed a strategy that was unusual, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of certain types of offenders, suggesting that if the location of the first victim's home and grave site were published and made widely known, the person responsible might be drawn to visit those locations. With the agreement of the Kellerman family, Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene published a piece that included the address of the family home and the location of Mary Kellerman's grave, and both sites were placed under 24-hour video surveillance for several months thereafter. The killer did not surface. The grave and the house remained quiet under their watch, the cameras recording nothing of significance, and the strategy, conceived with genuine professional care, yielded nothing in the way of the breakthrough that had been hoped for. It is worth noting how this particular investigative approach reflects the state of forensic science and criminal psychology. In 1983, the reliance on behavioral theory and surveillance in a period before DNA analysis had become a routine tool of criminal investigation before the technologies that would eventually be brought to bear on this case had even been conceived. The world of forensic investigation in 1983 was a world of fingerprints and photographs and behavioral profiles, of informants and surveillance, and the careful reading of physical evidence under laboratory conditions that, sophisticated as they were for their time, would come to seem limited in the light of what the following decades would make possible. The question of motive, which detectives and analysts had been turning over since the first days of the investigation, continued to resist the kind of simple and explanatory answer that makes a case comprehensible. In most crimes of violence, motive provides a thread that, when followed, leads eventually to an understanding of the crime's origins and, often, to the identification of its perpetrator. But in the Chicago Tylenol murders, the absence of any apparent specific target among the victims, the geographical distribution of the contaminated bottles across multiple stores in different suburban communities, and the utter randomness of the victim's selection created an investigative landscape in which the usual reasoning about motive had very limited traction. The victims had no connection to one another, had purchased their Tylenol from different stores, and had done nothing that could have brought them to the specific attention of a person with a particular grievance. They were, in the most complete and devastating sense of the word, random, chosen not by who they were, but simply by the accident of which bottle they happened to reach for, which shelf they happened to pass, which Tuesday morning happened to find them with a sore throat or a headache and a bottle of pain, relief close at hand. This randomness was itself one of the most deeply unsettling features of the case. not only for the public, who found in it the disturbing implication that safety could not be earned through any behavior or precaution, but for the investigators, who found in it the absence of the usual navigational tools. Criminal profilers who examined the case, including those associated with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, reportedly observed that the person who committed these murders did not fit neatly into the categories and patterns that their guidelines had been developed to describe, that the profile of someone willing to kill random strangers through the untraceable mechanism of contaminated commercial products represented a genuinely unusual configuration of psychology and planning and detachment from consequences. And so the investigation continued through 1983, patient and thorough, accumulating evidence that it could not yet fully read. The passage of years brought to the case the same thing it brings to all things: a gradual deepening of context, a layering of new information upon old, a slow expansion of the tools available to those who continued to seek answers. The 25th anniversary of the murders in 2007 prompted a renewal of public attention and, with it, a renewed investment of investigative resources, as the FBI acknowledged that advances in forensic technology had made it appropriate to take a second look at the case and the evidence that had been preserved. The Bureau's written statement on the renewed investigations explained, with the measured and careful language of institutions that must communicate about active cases without compromising them, that the review was prompted in part by the anniversary and the resulting publicity, and in part by the recognition that the forensic science of 2007 was meaningfully different from the forensic science of 1982, that evidence which had once yielded nothing might now, under the light of new analytical methods, yield something of value. In early January of 2009, federal agents searched the home of James Lewis in Cambridge, Massachusetts, seizing items for examination, an action that was widely reported and that signaled a continued focus on Lewis as a person of ongoing investigative interest, even as the legal standard for charging him with the murders had not yet been met. Court documents released around the same time reportedly contained the conclusion of Department of Justice investigators that Lewis was responsible for the poisonings, despite the acknowledgement that the available evidence was insufficient to support a criminal charge, a formulation that captures the particular and frustrating condition of a case in which institutional judgment and legal certainty exist in separate and non-overlapping categories. In January of 2010, Lewis and his wife both provided DNA samples and fingerprints to investigators. And Lewis, speaking publicly about the submission, expressed confidence that the results would clear him, saying that if the inquiry was conducted fairly, he had nothing to worry about. The DNA samples were compared against genetic material recovered from the tainted bottles. The samples did not match, and so the case continued, carrying its unanswered questions forward into the next decade and the next, each year adding new distance between the events of 1982 and the present, while the fundamental mystery at its center remained undisturbed. Here, in the breathing space of these reflections, it becomes possible to sit for a moment with what the story of the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders asks of us in the broader register of thinking about human societies and the vulnerabilities they carry within them, the places where trust and ordinary life create the conditions for harm, as naturally and inevitably as they create the conditions for everything else that holds a community together. Every bottle of medication that anyone takes from a shelf in a drugstore or a supermarket today Every foil seal that a hand breaks on the way to the small relief of a headache remedy is in some quiet and material sense a consequence of the events of that autumn, a product of the recognition that vulnerability exists where we least expect to find it, and that the answer to its discovery is not despair, but the patient, practical work of designing better protections. The 7 people who died in the Chicago suburbs in September and October of 1982 did not die as the result of a natural catastrophe, did not die as the result of a failure of science or medicine or institutional competence, but as the result of a deliberate act of harm. And yet what followed their deaths was, in its way, one of the more thoroughgoing examples of a society recognizing a new category of danger and responding to it with legislative, regulatory, and commercial changes that have protected an immeasurable number of lives in the decades since. The caplet sits in its sealed bottle, under its foil seal, inside its sealed box, and most people who open it on an ordinary morning for an ordinary headache give none of this any thought at all, which is perhaps the most complete tribute that could be offered to the changes that were made, that the protection has become so ordinary, so expected, so thoroughly woven into the texture of the everyday, that it no longer requires attention. The investigation remains open, the question remains unanswered, and the autumn of 1982 remains, in the long, quiet library of American history, a chapter that was never quite closed, a door left slightly ajar, waiting with the patience of the unresolved for whatever light the years still ahead of us may eventually bring, continuing seamlessly from where the previous 6 chapters concluded. The story now moves deeper into the decades that followed the autumn of 1982, into the long institutional memory of an unsolved case and the world it quietly reshaped. The year 1983 gave way to 1984, and 1984 gave way to the years beyond. And through all of them, the Chicago Tylenol murder investigation persisted in the particular way that major, unsolved cases persist, carried forward not by the urgency of breaking developments, but by the steady, unglamorous commitment of the investigators assigned to it. The filing clerks who maintained the evidence, the analysts who had returned periodically to the accumulated record to see whether anything looked different in the light of a new day. The case had by this point generated an evidence archive of considerable size, thousands of pages of witness statements, laboratory reports, tip summaries, and investigative memoranda. Each document a small fragment of the larger picture that the inquiry had been seeking to assemble since those first bewildering days of late September 1982. The detectives who worked the case in its later years were in some instances different from those who had worked it at the beginning. The original investigators have retired or moved on or passed away, their notes and files and institutional memory handed forward to a new generation of professionals who had to reconstruct from the documentary record the texture of an investigation they had not themselves lived through. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained its involvement through the 1980s, and into the 1990s, its Chicago field office periodically revisiting the evidence with the hope that some new analytical technique or some newly surfaced witness or some fragment of information not previously connected to others might resolve the central question. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office similarly kept the case in a kind of official suspension, neither closed nor actively prosecuted, occupying the particular administrative limbo of cases in which sufficient evidence for a charge has not been established, but in which institutional judgment has not been prepared to declare the investigation over. Meanwhile, James Lewis, having served his sentence for extortion, had been released from federal prison and had returned to ordinary life, first in New York and later in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he lived with his wife Nancy, working as a computer programmer and apparently subsisting on the margins of a society that knew his name in connection with these events without having formally established his guilt. The press occasionally sought him out, and he occasionally spoke, and his statements in those encounters were consistent in their structure, if not always in their specific content, maintaining his denial of involvement in the murders while acknowledging the extortion letter and offering varying explanations of its purpose that shifted, sometimes in small ways and sometimes in more significant ones, over the years. Roger Arnold was in prison, serving his sentence for the shooting of John Stanisha, the man he had mistaken for the bar owner who had reported him to police, and his connection to the Tylenol case receded into the background of the investigation, without ever disappearing from its files entirely. The city of Chicago, for its part, moved through the 1980s with the Tylenol murders as a kind of permanent low note in its civic consciousness, a chapter that had never been fully closed, present in the memory of everyone who had lived through those autumn weeks, and in the awareness of those who had come of age afterward and learned the story as history rather than as lived experience. And so the years passed, each one adding a little more distance between the events of 1982 and the present, while the question at the center of everything remained, as it had always been, unanswered and patient and quietly persistent: the transformation of over-the-counter pharmaceutical packaging in the years. Following 1982 was not a single event, but a process, unfolding across months and years through the combined efforts of regulators, manufacturers, designers, engineers, and the steady pressure of a public that had been made permanently attentive to a vulnerability it had not previously needed to think about. The Food and Drug Administration had issued its initial tamper-evident packaging regulations relatively quickly in the aftermath of the murders, responding to the urgency of the situation with a speed that was unusual for a regulatory process normally characterized by lengthy periods of public comment and institutional review. And those initial regulations had established the basic framework within which the industry began to redesign its products. The foil seal pressed across the mouth of the bottle and bearing a printed messages that would read something like, "Sealed for your protection," in the language of that era, became the first and most visible element of the new packaging regime, a small aluminum membrane that had to be punctured or peeled before the product inside could be accessed, and whose integrity, or lack thereof, was immediately apparent to anyone who picked up the bottle. The outer box was equipped with printed seals at its edges, lines of printed text that ran across the flap closures, and that would show obvious evidence of disruption if the box had been opened, providing a secondary visible indicator of whether the product had been accessed before purchase. The plastic band or shrink wrap around the bottle cap was the third element of what became known as the triple seal system, visible evidence that the cap had not been turned since the product left the manufacturing facility, a small plastic detail with enormous symbolic significance in the consumer culture of the mid-1980s. Johnson had moved with particular speed in implementing these changes for its Tylenol line, driven both by the urgency of restoring public confidence in a brand that had nearly been destroyed, and by the genuine institutional commitment to consumer safety that James Burke and his executive team had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Other pharmaceutical manufacturers followed, some more quickly than others, all of them under the combined pressure of regulatory requirement, commercial necessity, and the simple ethical understanding that the vulnerability which had been so tragically illustrated in Chicago applied to their products as well as to Tylenol. The capsule form itself came under sustained scrutiny during this period, with manufacturers recognizing that the two-piece, separable construction of the powder-filled capsule, whatever its advantages in terms of swallowing ease and medication delivery, created a structural accessibility that no amount of external packaging could fully eliminate once a product had been purchased and brought into a home. By the middle of the 1980s, the caplet had emerged as the dominant alternative, a solid pressed tablet shaped to approximate the elongated oval of a capsule, designed to be swallowed with similar ease, while eliminating the seam that made capsules separable, and the market relatively rapid adoption of this form reflected the depth of the public's anxiety about capsules in the aftermath of the Chicago events. Over the next several years, the combined effect of regulatory requirement and market preference reshaped the landscape of over-the-counter medication in the United States so thoroughly that a child born in 1985 would grow up in a world where tamper-evident packaging was simply the natural and expected condition of pharmaceutical products, where the foil seal and the plastic band were as ordinary and unremarkable as the bottle itself. The transformation was complete, and it was permanent, and it stood as one of the more tangible and measurable legacies of the 7 deaths. In the autumn of 1982, a set of physical changes to the material world that endured long after the grief and the fear and the headlines had faded into the quieter register of historical memory. The Johnson & Johnson crisis response, studied now for more than 4 decades in business schools and public relations programs and organizational behavior courses, occupies a place in the literature of corporate management that is unusual in its clarity and its longevity, a case whose lessons have remained relevant through enormous changes in the commercial, technological, and regulatory environment in which corporations operate. The central teaching that has been drawn from Johnson & Johnson's response is, at its simplest, the proposition that a company that places the welfare of the public genuinely ahead of its financial interests in a moment of crisis will over time be rewarded for that choice in ways that more than compensate for the short-term cost, a proposition that is easy to state in a classroom and very difficult to act upon when the quarterly earnings projections are visible on the table and the legal counsel is advising caution. James Burke, who served as chief executive of Johnson & Johnson until 1989, gave numerous interviews and lectures in the years following the Tylenol crisis, in which he reflected on the decisions that had been made in those October days. And in these reflections, he consistently attributed the company's response to the values articulated in the Credo, the document written by Robert Wood Johnson II in 1943, that placed responsibility to consumers and to the broader community ahead of responsibility to shareholders in the hierarchy of the company's obligations. The Credo, it should be noted, had been a subject of some internal debate at Johnson & Johnson in the years before the crisis, with some executives and managers questioning whether it represented a genuinely operational set of values or merely an aspirational statement of the kind that corporations produce for public consumption and then set aside when the practical pressures of commercial life assert themselves. Burke had, in fact, organized a series of internal management meetings in 1979, specifically to test the credo's living relevance to the company's actual decision-making, a process he described as a challenge to the document itself, an invitation to either reaffirm it as a genuine guide to behavior or to discard it honestly in favor of something that more accurately reflected how the company actually operated. The fact that the credo had been reaffirmed through that process and had therefore been genuinely present as an operational document in the minds of the company's leadership. When the crisis arrived 3 years later is credited by Burke and by those who have studied the case as a significant factor in explaining why the decisions made in October 1982 were made as quickly and as decisively as they were. Harold Burson, the public relations executive, whose counsel shaped the company's external communications during the crisis, later reflected that the speed of the decision to conduct a nationwide recall, which was announced on October 5th, just a week after the first deaths, was itself a significant element of the response's effectiveness, that the public's perception of a company's sincerity in a crisis is substantially shaped by whether the company's response appears to precede the development of a regulatory or legal mandate, or to follow it. The financial consequences of the recall, the loss of more than $100 million in product value, and the collapse of Tylenol's market share from approximately 35 to approximately 8%, were absorbed by a company large enough to bear them. And this scale was not incidental to the story, for a smaller company in similar circumstances might have found the cost of such a response genuinely existential. Over the next year, through the combination of the reintroduction with new packaging, aggressive promotional pricing, and a public communications effort of considerable sophistication, Tylenol recovered most of its lost market share, and by the mid-1980s, it had returned to its position as the best-selling over-the-counter analgesic in the United States, a commercial restoration that the business press widely attributed to the quality of the crisis response. The case has been taught and analyzed and written about so extensively that it has accumulated its own scholarly literature, its own set of competing interpretations and contextual complications. And yet at its center, the basic facts remain simple and clear. A company faced a devastating and unprecedented crisis, made decisions guided by a genuine prior commitment to public welfare, paid an enormous short-term cost, and recovered to a position of market strength that endured for decades. And in the cabinets and closets and bedside tables of millions of American households, the sealed bottles remain, each foil membrane a quiet reminder of what was learned in the autumn of 1982. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act, which passed the United States Congress and was signed into law in 1983, represented the legislative dimension of the national response to the Chicago murders, establishing for the first time a specific federal criminal category for the act of tampering with consumer products and providing prosecutors with legal tools that had simply not existed in American law before September of 1982. Before the act, a person who tampered with a commercial product with the intention of causing harm could be charged under a variety of existing statutes, including assault, attempted murder, or poisoning, depending on the jurisdiction and the specific circumstances. But no single federal law addressed the act of product tampering as a discrete category of criminal conduct, and the jurisdictional complexities of an act that might involve manufacturing in one state, distribution through multiple states, and purchase and consumption in yet another created genuine legal ambiguities that the existing framework was not well designed to resolve. The Act defined tampering with consumer products in broad and specific terms covering any act of rendering a product injurious to health by introducing foreign matter or by adulterating it in any way, and it established graduated penalties based on the severity of the harm caused, with provisions for sentences of up to life imprisonment in cases where the tampering resulted in death. The Act also created a separate offence of threatening to tamper with consumer products or making false claims of having done so, capturing the category of conduct that James Lewis had engaged in with his extortion letter, and ensuring that the legal system had adequate tools to respond to the full range of harmful behaviours associated with product tampering, from the Act itself to the threat of it. The passage of the Act moved through Congress with unusual speed by the standards of the legislative process, reflecting both the urgency communicated by the events of 1982 and the bipartisan consensus that the existing legal framework was genuinely inadequate to address what those events had revealed. Testimony before the relevant congressional committees came from law enforcement officials, public health experts, representatives of the pharmaceutical and food industries, and consumer advocacy organizations, all of them contributing to the legislative record, the particular perspectives, their institutional roles, equipped them to offer, and the hearings provided a kind of public accounting of the full dimensions of the problem that helped to build and sustain the legislative momentum. The Food and Drug Administration worked in parallel with the legislative process, developing through its own regulatory authority the requirements for tamper-evident packaging that would eventually be codified in binding regulations, and the timing of the regulatory development and the legislative development was such that both pieces of the new framework took shape in the same period, each reinforcing and complementing the other. In subsequent years, as copycat tampering incidents continued to occur at a low but persistent level, the Federal Anti-Tampering Act provided prosecutors with a clear and specific legal basis for charges, and a series of convictions under the Act demonstrated that its deterrent function was at least partially effective, that the existence of a specific federal felony carrying serious penalties did influence the calculations of at least some potential offenders. The Act was amended and updated in the years that followed its initial passage, with Congress periodically revisiting its provisions in light of new circumstances and new categories of tampering incidents that the original legislative drafters had not anticipated, each amendment adding another layer to the legal architecture that the Tylenol murders had made necessary. The congressional record of the hearings and debates surrounding the passage of the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, preserved in the archives of the United States Senate and House of Representatives, constitutes a detailed documentary account of a legislative process, responding to a genuine and unprecedented crisis, a record of the institutional mechanisms through which a society translates the lessons of disaster into the durable language of law. And in that translation, as in so many of the changes that flowed from the events of 1982, the 7 people who died in the Chicago suburbs remain present as the human reality against which all the institutional machinery was brought to bear the irreducible fact that gave the legislations its urgency and its moral weight. The social and cultural dimensions of the Tylenol murders extended well beyond the immediate policy responses and into the broader textures of American life in the 1980s, shaping the way people thought about consumer products, about corporate responsibility, about the relationship between individual safety and the systems that were supposed to guarantee it, in ways that were sometimes visible and explicit, and sometimes quiet and diffuse, but no less real. The fear that had descended on the Chicago metropolitan area in in the first days of October 1982, the fear that had sent police cars moving slowly through residential streets, with their loudspeakers broadcasting warnings, that had flooded hospital emergency departments, with people uncertain whether the Tylenol they had taken that morning was safe. That had prompted the remarkable sight of a major city systematically clearing the shelves of its pharmacies and grocery stores of a single product was not a fear that simply dissipated when the immediate crisis had passed. It lingered, transformed, integrated itself into the ordinary habits and assumptions of daily life in ways that were not always consciously articulated, becoming part of the background texture of a culture that had learned, in a particularly concrete and visceral way, that commercial products could be vectors of harm, that the chain of custody between manufacturer and consumer was longer and more complex and more vulnerable than most people had previously had reason to think about. The Halloween of 1982, coming just a month after the murders, and in the middle of the widespread fear and copycat incidents that the initial events had generated, became a kind of emblem of this new anxiety, with communities across the country limiting trick-or-treating activities, warning parents to inspect candy before allowing children to eat it, and creating an atmosphere around a holiday that had previously been characterized by casual, cheerful participation in the rituals of suburban American childhood that was now weighted with a specific and articulable caution. Hospitals in several cities offered to X-ray Halloween candy for signs of tampering, a service that was taken up by many parents, and that reflected both the genuine anxiety of the moment and the institutional desire to provide some concrete form of reassurance in the face of a fear that was difficult to address in other ways. The food and beverage industries, watching the pharmaceutical industry's response to the Tylenol crisis, began their own process of reassessment, recognizing that the vulnerability that had been so dramatically illustrated was not specific to medications, but was in principle applicable to any packaged food or drink product. And this reassessment gradually produced changes in food packaging as well, though the process was slower and more complex, given the far greater diversity of food products and packaging types. Writers and journalists and cultural commentators of the 1980s noted what they described as a new kind of consumer vigilance, a habit of checking and inspecting and questioning that had not been characteristic of American consumer culture before 1982, and that represented a permanent, if subtle, shift in the relationship between people and the products they purchased. The advertising industry adapted to this new vigilance, with pharmaceutical and food companies placing increasing emphasis in their marketing on the visibility and reliability of their safety measures, on the tamper-evident features of their packaging, on the transparency of their manufacturing processes, communicating to a public that had reason to be attentive a message that was designed to address that attentiveness directly. The American Consumer Product Safety Commission, working alongside the Food and Drug Administration, expanded its focus during the mid-1980s to incorporate the lessons of the Tylenol crisis into its broader regulatory framework, developing new standards and inspection protocols that addressed the specific vulnerabilities the crisis had identified, and that applied across a wider range of consumer products than the pharmaceutical sector alone. In the literature of risk perception and consumer psychology that developed in the academic disciplines of sociology, public health, and marketing during the 1980s and 1990s, the Tylenol murders occupy a central place as a case study in how a single high-profile event can fundamentally alter a population's sense of the risks associated with ordinary commercial activities, shifting the baseline from which people evaluate the safety of the products they encounter in daily life. The changes were not all visible or dramatic, many of them unfolding quietly in the habits of ordinary people going about ordinary days, in the small additional moment of attention given to the foil seal before the bottle was opened, in the slightly longer pause before accepting an opened package, in the thousand small recalibrations of trust and caution that together constitute the cultural aftermath of a transformative event. Over the next decade, these shifts became so thoroughly absorbed into the ordinary expectations of American consumer culture that they ceased to be experienced as responses to a crisis and simply became the natural and expected texture of the world, as it was a reminder, if one were needed, of how completely and permanently a society can be changed by the events of a single autumn. The media coverage of the Tylenol murders in their immediate aftermath was itself a significant force in shaping both public perception and institutional response, and the way the story was reported in the newspapers and television broadcasts of late September and early October 1982 reflects the particular character of journalism in that era. Before the proliferation of cable news, and before the internet had created the continuous and instantaneous information environment that came to characterize the following decades, the major Chicago newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times, covered the story with the thoroughness expected of metropolitan dailies confronting a crisis of this magnitude in their own city, dispatching reporters to the homes of victims, to hospital emergency departments, to pharmacy shelves, to police press conferences, assembling a daily chronicle of the unfolding events that served as the primary information source for a population seeking to understand what was happening. Television news, in the form of the local Chicago affiliates and the national broadcast networks, brought the story to a national audience with the particular gravity and visual immediacy that the medium provided, the faces of anchors and reporters communicating through their measured tones and careful language, both the seriousness of what had occurred and the institutional resolve to keep the public informed. The coverage was not without its complications, and media critics of the era noted that the extensive and detailed reporting on the nature of the tampering, on the relatively simple mechanism by which cyanide had been introduced into the capsules, may have contributed to the proliferation of copycat incidents that followed, providing potential imitators with information about method that they might not otherwise have possessed. This tension between the public's right to information and the potential for that information to facilitate harm is a recurring feature of the media ethics literature that the Tylenol case generated, a tension that has not been fully resolved in the decades since, and that recurs in the coverage of product tampering incidents and other events where the details of the method carry potential for misuse. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the other major national newspapers of the era brought their editorial resources to bear on the story, producing analyses and commentary that situated the Tylenol murders within broader discussions of consumer safety, corporate responsibility, and the limits of the regulatory framework for protecting the public from deliberate product contamination. Time magazine and Newsweek, the major weekly news magazines of that period, offered longer-form retrospectives that provided a degree of analytical distance and contextual depth that the daily newspapers, working under the pressure of continuous developments, were not always able to provide. and these pieces contributed to the development of a coherent public narrative about the events and their significance. The role of reporter Mike Shallett of WMake TV in Chicago, who was one of the first broadcast journalists to connect the multiple deaths to a possible common cause on the night of September 29th, is credited by some accounts of the crisis with accelerating the pace at which the investigation reached a public stage. His early on-air reporting prompting emergency room physicians and pharmacists to make connections they might otherwise have taken longer to make, a reminder that the flow of information between journalism and public health is not always or only in the direction from official sources to media to public. The press coverage of the Tylenol murders has been studied extensively by scholars of journalism history and media ethics, and the case is regularly included in discussions of how the media should balance the competing demands of public information, potential harm facilitation, and the institutional interests of the corporations and government agencies that are subjects of the coverage. In the broader narrative of American journalism in the 1980s, the Tylenol story stands as an example of the press functioning with something close to its ideal self, moving quickly and accurately in the face of a genuine public health crisis, communicating urgent safety information to a large and dispersed population, while also grappling honestly with the ethical complexities of covering a story whose details were themselves potentially dangerous. And in the individual dispatches and broadcasts of those October days, in the archived pages of the Chicago Tribune, and in the recordings of the evening news broadcasts, there remains a documentary record of a society in the process of understanding something new about itself, processing in real time the discovery that ordinary life carried within it, a vulnerability that had not previously been named, feeling its way toward the responses that would, over the following months and years, reshape the material and legal and cultural landscape of American consumer life. The investigation, meanwhile, had not stood still through the years of legislative action and cultural processing and corporate reconstruction, though its visible developments had become less frequent as the initial urgency faded, and the case settled into the longer rhythm of an unsolved matter. Through the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, the Chicago Police Department's Unsolved Crimes Unit and the FBI's Chicago Field Office maintained what investigators described as an active interest in the case, reviewing periodically the accumulated evidence and considering whether new leads or new techniques warranted renewed investigative effort. The evidence preserved from the original investigation included the tainted bottles themselves, carefully stored and catalogued in the inventory of the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, along with samples of the potassium cyanide that had been recovered from the capsules, and an array of physical items collected from the various crime scenes and from the homes of the primary suspects, each one tagged and archived with the meticulous care that major case evidence requires. DNA analysis, which had been in its scientific infancy in 1982, and had not yet developed into the reliable forensic tool it would become, began to emerge during the late 1980s. As a technique of genuine investigative value, and investigators working on the Tylenol case began to consider whether the new methodology might be applicable to the physical evidence they possessed, whether samples recovered from the bottles or the capsules might yield genetic material that could be compared against known samples from the suspects and either excluded or identified. The first application of DNA analysis to the Tylenol evidence occurred in the late 1980s, or early 1990 AS, though the results of this analysis were not publicly disclosed in detail, and the official communications from the investigating agencies maintained the careful and measured language that characterizes active case communications, acknowledging the ongoing investigation without compromising its operational details. In 2007, as the 25th anniversary of the murders approached and brought with it a renewal of public and press attention, the FBI formally announced that it was conducting a comprehensive review of the case, acknowledging that advances in forensic technology since 1982 justified a thorough re-examination of the existing evidence, and that new techniques might produce results that the earlier analyses had been unable to achieve. This announcement was received by those who had followed the case over the years with a mixture of measured hope and the cautious expectation that had been earned through decades of unresolved developments. The awareness that major unsolved cases do not often yield their secrets simply because the anniversary of their occurrence has arrived. The review involved the examination of the preserved physical evidence with the full range of modern forensic techniques, including advanced DNA profiling methods that could extract and analyze genetic material from quantities and qualities of sample that would have been inadequate for analysis under the methods available in the 1980s, and the review was conducted with the thoroughness that a case of this significance warranted. When federal agents searched the Cambridge, Massachusetts home of James Lewis in January of 2009, seizing computers and other items, the action was understood by those who covered the case as an indication that the review had generated at least some investigative momentum, some basis for renewed focus on Lewis as a subject of active inquiry. The subsequent submission of DNA samples and fingerprints by Lewis and his wife in early 2010, and the comparison of those samples against genetic material from the tainted bottles, produced a result that was, in the language of forensic science, a non-match, meaning that the DNA recovered from the bottles did not correspond to the DNA profile of James Lewis, a finding that excluded him as the source of the genetic material on the bottles, without, by itself, resolving the broader question of his involvement in the murders. And so the case moved forward into the 2010s, carrying its unanswered questions with the same patient persistence that it had always carried them, the archived bottles and samples waiting in their carefully maintained storage, the investigative files expanding with each new review, the question at the center of everything unchanged. The story of Teresa Janus, the youngest of the 7 victims at 19 years of age, deserves to be held for a moment on its own. Not because her death was different in its nature from the deaths of the others, but because it carries within it a particular quality of detail that illuminates with special clarity the devastating randomness that characterized all of these events. Teresa had been married to Stanley Janus for only a short time when the autumn of 1982 arrived, and she was, by every account of those who knew her, in the earliest and most hopeful stages of an adult life that had just formally begun, a young woman with the ordinary expectations that attached themselves to the beginning of a marriage, to the sense of a future that is large and mostly unwritten, and full of the particular possibilities that belong to 19. She and Stanley had driven to the home of Stanley's brother Adam on the evening of September 29th, as so many others had done, to sit with the grief of an unexpected death, to be present with family in the way that families are present with each other in those first stunned hours after loss, and the gesture she and Stanley made in reaching for the bottle of Tylenol in Adam's home was so natural, so unremarkable, so entirely consistent with the behavior of young people with headaches, sitting in the middle of an emotionally exhausting evening, that it requires no explanation, and perhaps makes the tragedy more quietly devastating for that very fact. The medical personnel who attended to both Stanley and Teresa that evening, moving between two patients who had collapsed within the same household, within a short time of each other, were already working within a context of the day's earlier unexplained death, already aware that something in that house was connected to a pattern that had not yet been fully understood, and the speed with which the investigation subsequently connected the Janus family deaths to the other deaths of that day was in part a consequence of this clustering of the fact that three members of one family dying in close succession from the same cause created an unmistakable pattern that the investigators at the scene could not fail to notice. Teresa Janus did not die immediately, surviving briefly after her collapse, long enough for those around her to hope that she might recover before her condition declined and she passed away, and the brief duration of that interval, the space between the possibility of survival and the reality of its absence, belongs to the most sorrowful territory of this story. In the years since 1982, the Janus family has been represented in the press and in documentary accounts of the Tylenol murders by the bare facts of their deaths and the bare facts of their ages and circumstances. And these facts are, of course, the necessary material of historical record. But they carry within them, if one pauses with them, a weight of human reality that is worth acknowledging, the reality of three people who had their ordinary morning routines and their ordinary plans and their ordinary relationships and their ordinary futures, and who encountered in the most ordinary of objects and the most ordinary of gestures something that ended all of it. The historical record preserves their names and the dates and the facts. And this preservation is itself a form of respect, the acknowledgement that they were here and that what happened to them mattered and continues to matter in the accounting that history makes of the events it records. The role of pharmacists and retail employees in the immediate aftermath of the Chicago Tylenol murders is a dimension of the story that received less public attention than the responses of Johnson & Johnson or the federal government. And yet, it was at the retail level that the crisis was most directly and immediately experienced. And it was the pharmacists and store managers and counter staff of Chicago's drugstores and grocery stores who were on the front lines of both the information effort and the logistical challenge of removing millions of bottles of a product from the shelves of thousands of stores across a metropolitan area. Pharmacists who in 1982 occupied a role in American healthcare that was in some ways more direct and more trusted than it has, subsequently become as the large chain pharmacy model that came to dominate the later decades had not yet fully displaced the community pharmacy in which the pharmacist knew the customers by name, received calls and visits from panicked customers throughout the days. Following the announcement, questions about whether they had recently purchased Tylenol, whether the bottle they had at home was safe, whether they should be concerned about other products, whether they should go to the hospital, and the pharmacists answered these questions with what information they had, and with the professional calm that their training and their role required. The Walgreens store on North Wells Street in Chicago, from which Paula Prince had purchased her Tylenol, and in which the surveillance photograph that would become a central piece of investigative interest had been taken, became a location of particular scrutiny during the investigation. Its records and its physical layout, examined by investigators seeking to reconstruct the movements of the unknown man visible behind prints in the photograph. Osco Drug, another major pharmacy chain in the Chicago area, had stocked products from the implicated lots in multiple locations, and its management cooperated fully with the recall effort, directing store personnel to remove Tylenol products from shelves and to collect and preserve any bottles that customers brought in for inspection. The logistical challenge of the recall, which required the removal of an estimated 31 million bottles of Tylenol capsules from retail outlets across the entire United States, involved a coordination between Johnson and Johnson's distribution network, the wholesale distributors who supplied the retail chains, and the individual store personnel who physically removed the products from shelves, and was accomplished with a thoroughness that industry analysts of the era noted as remarkable. Given the size and complexity of the distribution system involved, independent pharmacy owners across the Chicago area took it upon themselves to post notices in their windows and at their counters, informing customers of the recall and offering guidance on alternative products, acting on a sense of professional and community responsibility that reflected the particular character of the pharmacy's role in American community life. The grocery stores, many of which stocked Tylenol in their health and beauty sections, alongside dozens of other over-the-counter medications, faced the additional challenge of managing customer anxiety about the safety of the surrounding products, as shoppers who came in to purchase ordinary groceries moved through aisles that now carried an association with danger that had not been there the previous week. The distribution and retail infrastructure of the American pharmaceutical market, which by 1982 was already a system of considerable scale and complexity, was tested by the recall in ways that revealed both its strengths, the speed and thoroughness with which it could be mobilized to respond to a crisis directive, and its limitations, the difficulty of ensuring complete compliance across thousands of independent retail outlets, some of which were slow to receive or act upon the recall information. In the months and years following the crisis, the relationships between pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, and retailers were reshaped in ways that gave manufacturers greater visibility into and control over the downstream handling of their products, with new contractual and operational arrangements designed to ensure that a recall of the scale and speed required in 1982 could be executed even more effectively if it were ever necessary again. The pharmacists and retail employees of Chicago, going about the difficult and unglamorous work of those autumn days, added their own chapter to the story of a crisis responded to with thoroughness and care. Working at the level of the individual customer and the individual bottle in the same spirit that Johnson & Johnson was working, at the level of the entire national market, each part of the system doing what it could to contain the damage and restore the conditions of ordinary trust. In the broader landscape of American public health history, the Tylenol murders belong to a category of events that might be called catalytic crises, episodes that do not merely illustrate an existing problem, but that fundamentally alter the conceptual framework through which a problem is understood, creating before them and after them two distinct eras in the history of an institution or a practice or a set of assumptions. Before September of 1982, the concept of deliberate product tampering as a public health threat existed in theory, but not in the practical imagination of the regulatory and commercial systems that governed the manufacture and sale of consumer goods. And the regulatory framework in place was designed primarily to address the risks of accidental contamination, manufacturing error, and natural spoilage, not the intentional introduction of lethal substances into products already in the consumer supply chain. After October of 1982, the concept of deliberate tampering was permanently incorporated into the practical imagination of those systems, becoming a specific and named category of risk that required specific and named countermeasures. And this conceptual shift was itself one of the most consequential legacies of the events in Chicago, more durable in some ways than any specific regulatory change, because it altered the fundamental mental model through which regulators and manufacturers and retailers thought about the safety of the products they oversaw. The evolution of the regulatory framework in the years following 1982 reflects this conceptual shift in its specificity and its scope. The tamper-evident packaging requirements, the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, the expanded jurisdiction of the FDA over the security of the supply chain, each one a translation of the new conceptual framework into concrete institutional practice. The pharmaceutical industry's investment in what came to be called product security, a field that encompasses not only tamper-evident packaging, but also authentication mechanisms, supply chain monitoring, and anti-counterfeiting technology, grew substantially in the years following 1982, driven both by regulatory requirement and by the commercial recognition that the security of a product was itself a component of its value to consumers who had been made attentive to the possibility of tampering. The food industry, moving through a similar conceptual shift on a longer timeline, developed its own enhanced framework for what regulators termed intentional adulteration, eventually producing the regulations under the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011, that specifically addressed the risk of deliberate contamination of the food supply, a regulatory development that represented, in some sense, the completion of a process that had begun with the recognition in 1982 that deliberate adulteration of consumer products was a real and specific threat requiring a real and specific response. In academic public health and risk management literature, the Tylenol murders are regularly cited as the foundational case in the study of intentional product contamination as a public health risk, appearing in textbooks and journal articles and policy documents as the event that established the terms of the discussion and defined the categories through which subsequent incidents were understood and analyzed. The parallel histories of natural disease outbreaks and deliberate public health threats, which had previously occupied largely separate conceptual territories in the thinking of public health professionals, were brought into a new proximity by the events of 1982, as the recognition that a lethal agent introduced deliberately into commercial products could spread through the distribution system with much the same epidemiological pattern as a naturally occurring pathogen, created a new category of professional concern that drew on the methods and concepts of both disciplines. Over the next several decades, the public health community developed increasingly sophisticated frameworks for thinking about deliberate contamination and its relationship to the broader landscape of public health risk. Frameworks that would prove relevant not only to product tampering, but to the broader concerns about bioterrorism that came to prominence in American public health, thinking after the anthrax letter attacks of 2001. The story of the Tylenol murders, then, is not merely a story about 7 deaths and an unsolved crime and a corporate crisis response, though it is all of those things, but also a story about the evolution of an idea, about the way a single series of events can permanently expand the category of what a society considers possible, and therefore what it considers necessary to prepare for. And this evolution of the collective imagination is perhaps the most enduring and the most far-reaching of all the legacies that those 7 autumn deaths have left behind. The 25th anniversary of the murders in 2007 brought a renewal of public and journalistic attention that served as a kind of collective reckoning with the unresolved nature of the case, and with the passage of time itself, the recognition that 25 years had elapsed, and the central question remained as open as it had been on the first day of October 1982, when investigators had just begun to understand what they were dealing with. Major newspapers published retrospective accounts that reviewed the evidence and the suspects and the investigative history, drawing on interviews with retired investigators, former Johnson & Johnson executives, legal scholars, public health experts, and family members of the victims, assembling a 25-year accounting of a case that had shaped American consumer culture and American law without ever yielding the resolution that its victims' families had waited for through all of those years. The Chicago Tribune, whose coverage of the original events had been extensive, and whose institutional memory of the case ran deep, published a detailed anniversary investigation that reviewed the available evidence with the benefit of hindsight and the perspective of a quarter century. And that reporting contributed to the renewal of investigators' attention that the FBI's formal case review represented. Television documentaries about the Tylenol murders appeared with increasing frequency as the anniversary year approached, each one revisiting the familiar facts of the case and introducing them to an audience for whom the events of 1982 were history rather than lived experience, for whom the sealed bottles on the pharmacy shelves were simply the natural and expected condition of over-the-counter medications rather than a response to a specific and recent tragedy. The families of the victims, navigating public attention with the particular grace that comes from decades of practice, gave occasional interviews and participated in some of the documentary projects, their presence in the public record. A reminder that the case was not merely a historical puzzle or a policy case study, but a collection of unresolved losses of grief that had been carried forward through the years without the particular kind of resolution that a named perpetrator and a completed legal process provides. The retired investigators who appeared in the anniversary coverage spoke with the measured and careful language of professionals who had devoted significant portions of their careers to a case they had not been able to close, acknowledging the frustration of that condition while also communicating something of the enduring commitment that a case of this nature generates in those who have worked it for a long time. The sense that the obligation to the victims does not expire simply because the years have passed. Advances in forensic technology available in 2007 that had not been available in 1982 or even in the early 1990s included second and third generation DNA profiling methods, touch DNA analysis capable of recovering genetic material from surfaces touched by human hands, digital enhancement of the surveillance photographs that had been taken in the stores in question, and computational analysis tools that could process large bodies of investigative data in ways not previously possible. And each of these advances was considered in the context of the available Tylenol evidence to assess whether it might yield new information. The FBI's formal case review, announced publicly in conjunction with the anniversary, was understood by those who had followed the case as a genuine and substantive undertaking, rather than a ceremonial gesture, a conclusion supported by the subsequent search of James Lewis's Cambridge home in January 2009, which signaled that the review had produced at least some investigative basis for renewed focus. The 25th anniversary also served as an occasion for broader reflection on the changes that the Tylenol murders had produced in American consumer culture and American law and American corporate practice, a moment for taking stock of the distance traveled from the unprotected pharmaceutical shelves of 1982 to the multiply sealed products of 2007. And this reflection produced, across a wide range of publications and public discussions, a somewhat unusual combination of acknowledgement and incompleteness, the recognition of genuine and significant change existing alongside the recognition that the change had been purchased at a cost that had never fully been accounted for by the resolution of the crime that made it necessary. And here, in the long middle distance between the autumn of 1982 and the present, in the quiet space where the facts of the case have been laid out and allowed to settle, it becomes possible to attend to the reflective register that the full breadth of this story invites, to consider what the complete history of the Tylenol murders asks of anyone who takes the time to follow it carefully through all its dimensions. There is something in the enduring, unresolved nature of this case that belongs to a specific and important category of human experience, the experience of harm that cannot be fully accounted for, of loss that cannot be fully explained, of a question that the available tools of inquiry, however sophisticated and however earnestly applied, have not been able to answer with the certainty that justice requires. And this category of experience is not rare in human history, though it is rarely as fully documented as this case has been. The 7 people who died in the Chicago suburbs in the autumn of 1982 were not famous, were not powerful, were not in any conventional sense historical figures before that autumn found them, and yet the events of their deaths and the responses those deaths generated have given them a permanent place in the historical record, a presence in the ongoing story of how American society thinks about the safety of the objects that surround it and the obligations that institutions owe to the people they serve. The foil seal on the medication bottle is a small thing, a thin membrane of aluminum that takes less than a second to puncture, and yet it carries within it, for those who know its history, the weight of 7 lives and the work of thousands of people in law and medicine and corporate management and public health who responded to those losses with the best tools available to them. The unsealed nature of the central question, the identity of the person who opened those bottles and filled those capsules with poison and returned them to the shelves of Chicago's drugstores, does not diminish the significance of what was built in response to the losses of 1982, does not make the tamper-evident packaging less real, or the Federal Anti-Tampering Act less durable, or the corporate ethics lessons less instructive. But it does add to the story a quality of open-endedness, of incompleteness, that is itself historically significant. The reminder that the most consequential events are not always the ones that arrive with tidy resolutions, that the changes a society makes in response to harm can endure, long after the question of where the harm came from has ceased to be answerable with certainty. The families of Mary Kellerman and Adam Janus and Stanley Janus and Teresa Janus and Mary McFarland and Paula Prince and Mary Reiner have carried this open-endedness with them through all the decades since 1982, and the measure of grace with which they have done so, appearing when asked in interviews and documentaries, speaking carefully and with dignity about the losses they have sustained, and the questions that remain is itself a part of the record, a demonstration of the particular kind of endurance that the absence of resolution requires from those who have most reason to need it. The autumn light falls, as it has fallen every year since 1982, on the streets of Elk Grove Village and Arlington Heights and Elmhurst and Winfield and Chicago, on the corner drugstores and the grocery stores and the suburban houses with their ordinary front yards, and the world continues with all its ordinary textures. The sealed bottles on the pharmacy shelves, the foil membranes intact, the small aluminum testimony to the autumn, when ordinary life revealed its hidden fragility, and the people who lived through it resolved, with the thoroughness and the imperfection of human institutions, to build something safer in its place. Continuing seamlessly from where Chapter 12 concluded, the story now moves into its final passage through the cold case years of the new millennium, the Netflix era of renewed scrutiny, the forensic frontiers of the 2020s, and the quiet, enduring legacy of 7 lives lost on ordinary autumn mornings in the suburbs of Chicago. The year 2009 arrived with a particular kind of investigative energy surrounding the Tylenol murders, an energy that had been building since the formal FBI case review, announced in conjunction with the 25th anniversary, and that expressed itself in the visible and deliberate action of federal agents arriving at the Cambridge, Massachusetts home of James William Lewis on a morning in early January, carrying with them the legal authority to search the premises and seize materials they considered relevant to an investigation that was now more than a quarter century old. The search was not a quiet or unnoticed event, for James Lewis had lived in a state of public association with the Tylenol murders since his extortion letter had been traced to him in the autumn of 1982, and his neighbors and the reporters who covered the story were not unaware of his presence in Cambridge, and the arrival of federal agents at a private residence in a university city carries with it a kind of visible institutional weight that generates attention. Agents seized computers, documents, and other materials from the home, working through the premises with the methodical patience that a search of this nature requires, and their presence there was widely interpreted by journalists and by those who followed the case as a signal that the renewed investigation had produced something, some basis for renewed focus on Lewis, some thread worth following into the material record of his life and his work and his history. Lewis, for his part, maintained his public composure in the aftermath of the search, speaking to reporters with the practiced equanimity of someone who had been living under the shadow of suspicion for more than 2 decades and had developed, through that long experience, a manner of addressing questions about his guilt that was neither the aggressive denial of someone clearly alarmed, nor the open admission of someone prepared to confess, but something more careful and more opaque than either. His attorneys communicated the standard language of legal representation, noting that their client maintained his innocence, and that the search did not constitute a charge or an accusation in the formal legal sense. And these communications were received by the press with the same careful attention to nuance that they had been designed to require. The materials seized in the January 2009 search were added to the investigative archive and subjected to analysis. And the results of that analysis, like so many of the results that had been generated by the long investigation, were not publicly disclosed in a form that allowed outside observers to assess their significance or their implications for the central question. Court documents from proceedings related to the renewed investigation reportedly contained language suggesting that Justice Department investigators had reached a conclusion about Lewis's responsibility, while simultaneously acknowledging that the evidence available did not meet the legal standard required to support a criminal charge, a formulation that describes a condition familiar to those who work in the legal system, but deeply frustrating to those outside it who were waiting for the investigation to produce a definitive resolution. In the months following the search, Lewis and his wife, Nancy, submitted to DNA sampling and fingerprinting, cooperating with the investigators' request in a manner that Lewis publicly framed as evidence of his confidence in his own innocence, saying in an interview that if the process was conducted fairly, he had nothing to worry about, a statement that proved accurate in the narrow forensic sense when the DNA comparison produced a non-match, though the broader question of his relationship to the crimes was not resolved by that finding. The Cambridge years of James Lewis, from his arrival there after his release from federal prison to his death in July of 2023, constitute a long final chapter in the life of a man whose name had been permanently attached to one of America's most notorious unsolved crimes. A chapter lived largely in public shadow, under the awareness of ongoing investigative interest, interrupted periodically by searches and interviews and documentary filmmakers, sustained by the particular stubbornness of a man who maintained his denials through every form of scrutiny that 4 decades of renewed attention could bring to bear. And through those Cambridge years, the investigation continued in its patient institutional way, the archived evidence waiting in its carefully maintained storage. The question at the center of everything, maintaining its characteristics, and inexhaustible patience. The exhumation of Roger Arnold's body in 2010, conducted with the permission of his family and the authority of a legal process that recognized the investigative value of forensic evidence that had not been available at the time of his death, in June of 2008, represented a particular kind of investigative persistence that speaks to the commitment of those who had maintained the Tylenol murder case through all the decades since 1982. The willingness to pursue every available avenue of inquiry, even when that pursuit required the difficult and solemn procedure of disturbing a grave. Arnold had been considered a person of investigative interest since the earliest days of the case. His acknowledged possession of potassium cyanide, his history of making alarming statements about harming people, his employment at a Jewel Osco store in Melrose Park, and his indirect connections to some of the victims having combined to create a profile that investigators had never been able either to confirm as significant or to dismiss as irrelevant. His conviction in 1984 for the shooting death of John Stanisha, the man he had mistaken for the bar owner who reported him to police, and his subsequent imprisonment and eventual release had not removed him from the investigative landscape of the Tylenol case. And the DNA technology that had been applied to the case evidence in 2010 was also applied to genetic material obtained from his exhumed remains. The comparison of Arnold's DNA profile against the genetic material recovered from the tainted Tylenol bottles produced, like the comparison with Lewis's profile before it, a non-match. A finding that excluded Arnold as the source of the DNA on the bottles without, in the strict forensic sense, excluding him from all possible forms of involvement in the crimes, since the DNA on the bottles might have belonged to someone who handled them after the tampering was complete, rather than to the person who performed the tampering. The result of the Arnold exhumation was received by investigators and by those who followed the case with the particular mixture of clarity and incompleteness that had characterized so many of the investigation's developments over the years, the clarity being that the specific forensic question asked had been answered, and the incompleteness being that the broader question had not moved noticeably closer to resolution. Arnold's family, who had cooperated with the exhumation under circumstances that required a degree of trust in the good faith of the investigators and a degree of equanimity about the disturbance of a family member's remains, represented in their cooperation another of the many ways in which the Tylenol murders had touched the lives of people who were not themselves victims of the original crime, but who had been drawn into its orbit through their relationships with the men who had been suspected of it. The forensic work of the 2009 and 2010 period, taken together, represented the most technically sophisticated engagement with the Tylenol evidence that had yet occurred, applying the most current available methods of DNA analysis to evidence that had been preserved for nearly 3 decades. And the results, while not providing the resolution that had been hoped for, did produce a clearer picture of the forensic landscape, a set of exclusions that narrowed the field of possibility and preserved the integrity of the DNA profile recovered from the bottles for comparison against future candidates. The investigators who had worked the case for decades and who were now approaching or past the ends of their active careers reflected in interviews given around this time on the experience of working an unsolved major case through the long arc of a professional life, the evolution of the forensic technology available, the changes in the institutional structures within which the investigation operated, the persistence of the central question through all of it, and their reflections carried the particular quality of people who have given something significant of themselves to an enterprise that has not yet given back what they gave for. And the evidence waited, as it had always waited, archived and catalogued and carefully preserved, carrying within it whatever answers it contained, patient in the way that physical objects are patient, indifferent to the passage of time, in a way that the people who sought answers from it could never quite manage to be. The Netflix documentary series Cold Case, The Tylenol Murders, released in 2025, brought the story of the 1982 Chicago poisonings to a new generation of viewers in the specific format that streaming true crime documentary had developed over the preceding decade, a format characterized by extended runtime, access to archival materials, and the willingness to allow subjects to speak at length and in their own voice. And the series attracted substantial public attention, both for the prominence of the platform and for the fact that it featured, as a central participant, James Lewis himself, who agreed to be interviewed on camera in what would prove to be one of his final public appearances before his death in July of 2023. Lewis, appearing in the documentary in the last months of his life, spoke about the murders and his relationship to them with what viewers and critics described as a characteristic combination of apparent openness and careful opacity, neither confessing nor denying in terms provided the definitive clarity that the documentary's audience might have hoped for, maintaining the same essential position that he had maintained through 4 decades of public scrutiny, while providing enough new detail and new context to sustain the narrative momentum that the documentary format required. The series drew on a substantial archive of historical materials, including news footage and newspaper coverage from 1982, investigative records that had become available through Freedom of Information requests, interviews with retired investigators and with family members of the victims, and the documentary record of the legal proceedings that had involved Lewis over the course of his life. Assembling from these materials a comprehensive account of the case that served as both a historical document and a renewed argument about the central question of responsibility. Critical reception of the series was generally positive, with reviewers praising its thoroughness and its willingness to sit with the ambiguity of an unresolved case, rather than forcing the narrative toward a conclusion that the evidence did not support. Though some critics noted that the prominence given to Lewis's own testimony created an interpretive imbalance that the series did not fully acknowledge or address. The documentary's release prompted a further round of public discussion about the case, with social media platforms providing a new forum for the kind of amateur analysis and theory development that had previously been confined to dedicated websites and discussion forums. And the combination of the documentary's wide reach and the participatory character of contemporary media created a moment of renewed public engagement with a case that had periodically commanded such engagement over the 4 decades since the original events. Lewis died on the 9th of July, 2023, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the age of 76, approximately 2 months before the documentary was released. And the timing of his death relative to the documentary's production and release became itself a subject of discussion, with some accounts suggesting that he had participated in the filming, with an awareness that his health was declining and that the documentary might represent one of his last opportunities to speak publicly about his relationship to the case. The death of Lewis did not close the investigation, which remained officially open, but it did remove from the living world the person who had been most consistently at the center of investigative and public attention for 40 years, and it introduced into the case's history a new kind of finality. The foreclosure of the particular form of resolution that would have come from a confession or a conviction, the permanent absence of the person who might, under different circumstances, have provided the answer that the investigation had spent 4 decades seeking. The families of the 7 victims, navigating once again the renewal of public attention that the documentary represented, appeared in some accounts of the series' reception as continuing to carry the particular burden of a grief that public interest periodically refreshed without resolving, the grief of losses that the passage of time had softened without the resolution of justice, having provided the specific closure that the legal process is sometimes said to offer. In the broader landscape of true crime documentary as a cultural form, the Tylenol murders occupy a special place, a case that combines the genuine historical significance of its consequences, the compelling ambiguity of its unresolved central question, and the human weight of 7 ordinary lives, interrupted on ordinary mornings, into a narrative that resists the neat resolution that the genre sometimes imposes on its subjects, and that carries, in that resistance, something closer to the actual texture of how history unfolds. The ongoing scientific and forensic dimensions of the Tylenol murder investigation in the years of the 2010s and 2020s reflect the extraordinary pace of development in the biological and chemical sciences during this period, developments that have some respects brought new possibilities to old evidence and in other respects have underscored the limits of what can be recovered from physical materials after 4 decades of storage. However careful that storage has been, 2nd and 3rd generation DNA profiling techniques including the short tandem repeat analysis and the mitochondrial DNA analysis that became standard forensic tools in the 2000s and 2010s, were supplemented during this period by the development of investigative genetic genealogy, a methodology that had been used with considerable success in other cold cases, most notably the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, and that offered in principle a new approach to the central forensic question of the Tylenol case. Investigative genetic genealogy works by comparing a DNA profile derived from crime scene evidence against the large databases of consumer genetic testing services, identifying distant relatives of the unknown individual whose DNA has been recovered, and then using traditional genealogical research methods to build family trees that can eventually narrow the field to a small number of candidates whose DNA can then be directly compared against the crime scene profile. The application of this methodology to the Tylenol case was considered and discussed by investigators and by forensic science journalists in the years following the Golden State Killer breakthrough, and the possibility that the DNA recovered from the tainted bottles, if it belonged to the person who tampered with them, might eventually yield an identification through genealogical comparison, was one of the more substantive investigative hopes of the late 2010s and early 2020s. The challenges specific to the Tylenol evidence include the age of the samples, now more than 4 decades old, and subject to whatever degradation has occurred, despite careful storage, the uncertainty about whether the DNA recovered the bottles belonged to the perpetrator or to any of the many other people who might have handled the bottles in the course of their manufacture, distribution, and retail sale, and the legal and ethical frameworks governing the use of consumer genetic databases for law enforcement purposes, which remain subjects of ongoing discussion and policy development during this period. The FBI's combined DNA index system, which maintains profiles from convicted offenders and from crime scenes, does not in itself provide the genealogical search capability that investigative genetic genealogy requires, and the use of consumer databases, such as those maintained by GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA for law enforcement purposes, has been subject to varying terms of service and legal frameworks that have evolved as the methodology has developed. Illinois state investigators and FBI agents working the case in the early 2020s engaged with these methodological possibilities and their constraints, assessing whether the available evidence met the quality and quantity thresholds required for effective genealogical analysis, and communicating about those assessments in the measured and careful language that active case communication requires. The Illinois State Police, which had maintained a parallel involvement in the case alongside the federal agencies, announced in late 2022, around the 40th anniversary of the murders, that new DNA testing was being conducted on evidence from the case, a statement that represented the most recent formal public acknowledgement of active forensic work on the Tylenol evidence, and that suggested the investigative process remained genuinely ongoing rather than merely nominally open. The forensic science that was available in 2022 was in every meaningful respect more powerful and more sensitive than anything available in 1982 or even in 2009, and the application of its most current methods to evidence preserved from 4 decades earlier represented a genuine investigative possibility, a real chance that the physical record of those autumn days in 1982 still contained, in its molecules, an answer that the preceding decades of inquiry had not been able to extract. and the bottles waited, as they had always waited, in the carefully maintained archive of the Cook County Evidence System, carrying whatever they carried, patient and silent and indifferent to the urgency of the question that had been asked of them across the decades. The 40th anniversary of the Chicago Tylenol murders, observed in the autumn of 2022, brought with it a particular quality of reflection that distinguished it from earlier anniversaries, the quality of a milestone number, combined with the proximity of the renewed investigating activity, and the awareness that the primary suspects were aging or had already died, that the biological clock of the case was moving in ways that the calendar clock could not be made to reverse. The Chicago Tribune published a comprehensive timeline of key events in the case's history, from the first death on September 29th, 1982 through the decades of investigation and the periodic renewals of attention, a document that served as a comprehensive accounting of the 40 years elapsed and of what that time had and had not produced in the way of resolution. The Chicago History Museum, which had mounted exhibitions on the Tylenol murders over the years, and which maintained archival materials related to the case, marked the anniversary with renewed educational programming that situated the murders within the broader history of Chicago and of American consumer culture, drawing the connections between the events of 1982 and the world of sealed pharmaceutical bottles that its visitors moved through without thinking about their origins. The families of the 7 victims, for whom each anniversary represented a renewed encounter with grief and with the unresolved nature of their losses, gave interviews in some instances and chose privacy in others, each family navigating the anniversary in the way that made sense for them. Individually, their choices reflecting the diverse ways in which people carry long-term grief in public and in private. Retired investigators who had worked the case in its various phases appeared in anniversary coverage, some of them well into their own later years, speaking about the work they had done and the question that had resisted their efforts. And their reflections carried the particular weight of people whose professional identities had been shaped in significant ways by an engagement with a case they had not been able to close. The public discourse around the 40th anniversary included a renewed examination of the 2 primary suspects, Lewis and Arnold, in light of everything that had been learned about them in the decades since 1982, and the accumulated record of that examination produced in the best journalism and documentary work of the anniversary period, a nuanced and carefully evidenced picture of 2 men whose lives had intersected in complex ways with the investigation without that intersection having produced the legal resolution that the process was designed to produce. The Illinois State Police announcement of new DNA testing, coming in the 40th anniversary year, was widely covered and widely analysed, with forensic scientists and legal commentators offering their assessments of what the new testing might be capable of producing, and what conditions would need to be met for its results to be actionable in a legal proceeding. The anniversary also served as an occasion for the pharmaceutical industry to reflect publicly on the distance travelled since 1982, with industry publications and healthcare organisations marking the 40th year of tamper-evident packagings, with assessments of its effectiveness, and with discussions of the ongoing challenges of product security in a global supply chain of considerably greater complexity than the one that existed in the autumn of 1982. In schools of public health and public policy, the 40th anniversary generated new course materials and new case studies, new generations of students encountering the Tylenol murders as history, as policy case study, as forensic science problem and as an example of how a democratic society mobilizes its institutions in response to a crisis. Each new generation bringing to the material the particular perspective of people for whom the sealed bottles has always simply been the natural and expected condition of the world. In the years immediately following the 40th anniversary, the investigation continued with the particular quality of attention that the advanced forensic tools of the mid-2020s made possible, and with the awareness shared among the investigators and the families, and the journalists who had followed the case for decades, that the biological evidence available was aging, and that the window of possibility for a forensic resolution, while not yet closed, was subject to the same entropy that affects all physical things over time. The investigative genetic genealogy methodology that had transformed cold case investigation in the late 2010s remained a genuine possibility for the Tylenol case, contingent on the quality and quantity of DNA recoverable from the archived evidence, and on the legal and institutional frameworks governing its application. And investigators working the case in the mid-2020s were in a position to consider and potentially to apply this methodology in a way that their predecessors in the 1980s and 1990s could not have imagined. The CBS News Chicago affiliate and other local media outlets continued to cover the case with the consistency of institutions that understood it as a permanent and significant thread in the civic fabric of the Chicago metropolitan area. Periodic reporting on investigative developments, maintaining a baseline of public awareness that had been sustained across 4 decades, and that reflected the case's enduring place in the consciousness of the city and its suburbs. The families of the victims, aging now themselves, with Mary Kellerman's parents in their later years, and the siblings and children of the other victims, moving through their own adult lives, remained the human center of the story. The irreducible evidence that the events of 1982 were not only historical and institutional in their significance, but personal and ongoing in their weight, carried forward in the lives of specific people who had loved the 7 who died. The investigative community's engagement with the case in the mid-2020s was shaped by the recognition that the tools available represented genuinely new possibilities, not incremental improvements on methods already applied, but qualitatively different approaches to the forensic questions. And this recognition informed a renewed seriousness of investigative engagement that was visible in the institutional communications of the FBI's Chicago Field Office and the Illinois State Police. The legal framework governing any potential prosecution that might result from a forensic breakthrough was itself a subject of careful attention, with prosecutors and legal scholars examining the statutes of limitations applicable to the charges that would be relevant, the evidentiary standards that a case built primarily on forensic evidence would need to meet, and the constitutional and procedural considerations that would govern any proceeding in a case of this age and complexity. The social media communities that had grown up around true crime content in the 2010s and 2020s, including dedicated forums and podcasts and YouTube channels, focused on the Tylenol murders, represented a new form of public engagement with the case, one characterized by the participatory and distributed analysis that digital platforms enable, and the interaction between this community-level engagement and the formal investigative process was an interesting feature of the case's 21st century history, reflecting the broader shift in how unsolved crimes are publicly processed in the age of networked information. Forensic chemistry which had advanced alongside forensic biology in the years since 1982, offered its own possibilities for the Tylenol evidence, with the prospect of more detailed chemical analysis of the cyanide recovered from the original capsules, potentially yielding information about the source of the compound, the manufacturing process through which it was produced, and the distribution channels through which it might have been obtained in the early 1980s. Each of these threads representing a potential avenue toward the identification of the person who used it. The world of 2025 was not the world of 1982 in any dimension that a thoughtful comparison could identify. And yet the question that the world of 1982 had generated remained, connecting the two eras across the decades with a thread of unresolved inquiry that no amount of change in the surrounding circumstances had managed to break. The investigation remained open, the evidence remained archived, the question remained unanswered, and the autumn of 1982 remained present in the living memory of those old enough to have experienced it, and in the historical consciousness of those who had learned it afterward, a chapter that had never quite been closed. In the long view of American history, the story of the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders occupies a place that is both specific and representative. Specific in the particularity of its events and its people and its place and its time, and representative in what it illustrates about the relationship between vulnerability and response, between harm and the institutional mechanisms that societies build to prevent its recurrence. The 7 people who died in the suburbs of Chicago in the final days of September and the first days of October 1982 were not, in the conventional sense, historical figures. They were a 12-year-old girl with a sore throat and a postal worker, and a young couple at a family gathering, and a woman who had just given birth, and a flight attendant and a working mother, and the ordinariness of their lives and of the circumstances of their deaths is itself historically significant, a reminder that the events that most thoroughly reshape a society's institutions and habits are not always the ones involving great figures and grand causes, but sometimes the ones that find their way through the smallest and most ordinary gaps in the fabric of daily life. The changes produced by their deaths, the tamper-evident packaging, and the Federal Anti-Tampering Act, and the caplet and the revised FDA regulations, and the transformed corporate crisis management frameworks, and the new field of intentional product contamination, public health, constitute a legacy of institutional adaptation that has, in the most literal and measurable sense, saved lives, protected people who will never know that their safety was secured in part by the events of an autumn they did not live through, a protection built into the texture of the ordinary world so thoroughly that it no longer requires conscious acknowledgement to be effective. The unsolved nature of the central question, the permanent absence of a conviction and a sentence, and a formal legal accounting for the 7 deaths is not incidental to the story's meaning, but part of it. A reminder that justice, as a human institution, is imperfect and sometimes incomplete, that the machinery of investigation and prosecution, however sophisticated and however earnestly operated, does not always produce the resolution that the weight of the harm seems to demand. And yet the incompleteness of the legal resolution does not negate the completeness of the social response. The thoroughness with which a society recognized a new vulnerability, named it, built against it, and encoded the recognition in law and practice and material culture in ways that have proved durable across the decades. And there is something instructive in that distinction, in the understanding that a society can respond effectively to harm even when it cannot fully account for where the harm came from. The pharmaceutical shelves of 2026, wherever they may be found, in the chain drugstore and the supermarket and the corner pharmacy and the hospital dispensary, are lined with products sealed in ways that reflect the lessons of 1982, each foil membrane and plastic band and printed outer seal. A small material argument for the proposition that the response to vulnerability can outlast the uncertainty about its cause. The city of Chicago continues in its life, as cities do, carrying its history in the way that old cities carry history, in the names of streets and the architecture of buildings, and the institutional memories of hospitals and law enforcement agencies and newspapers that were present for events their current staff can know only through records and retrospectives. The suburban communities where the 7 victims lived and died continue as well. Elk Grove Village and Arlington Heights and Elmhurst and Winfield. Their ordinary rhythms of school days and commutes and corner stores and autumn leaves unchanged in their essential character from the rhythms of 1982, changed only in the particular and specific way that the sealed medicine bottle represents, the single alteration in the ordinary texture of domestic life that connects those communities to the events of 43 years ago. The families of the 7 victims move through their own continuing lives, carrying what they carry, marked in the ways that such losses mark people, sustained by whatever they have built in the years since the autumn that changed everything for them, present in the world in ways their loved ones were not permitted to remain. And here, in this quiet place at the end of a long journey through history and science and law and grief and institutional response and enduring mystery, the story rests for a moment in the awareness of all that it contains, all that it asks, all that it has produced, and all that it still cannot answer. A story as complete as the human record can make it, and as incomplete as the human condition always, and inevitably is. The reflective passages of this long account have returned several times to the question of what the Tylenol murders mean, what significance a thoughtful person should draw from the full arc of the story, and in approaching the final pages of that account, it seems right to attempt something like a considered answer to that question, knowing that any answer will be partial, and knowing that the incompleteness of an answer to a question this large is itself a form of honesty about the nature of the question. What the story means, in part, is that the systems through which a modern democratic society protects its citizens are not built in advance of the harms they are designed to prevent, but in response to them, that the tamper-evident packaging and the Federal Anti-Tampering Act and the transformed regulatory framework were not in place on the 1st of September 1982 because no one had yet understood that they were necessary, and that the understanding arrived through the particular and devastating method of 7 deaths that need not have occurred if the understanding had come earlier. This is not a comfortable observation, and it is not meant to be, but it is an honest one, and the discomfort it produces is the appropriate response to a recognition that the architecture of safety in which we move through our daily lives was built, in part, from the material of disasters. Each protective measure, the institutional memory of a harm that was sufficient to compel the construction of a defense. What the story also means is that the response to such harms, when it comes through the combination of institutional integrity and genuine public commitment, can be thorough and durable, and effective in ways that make the harm less likely to recur. That Johnson & Johnson's decision to prioritize public safety over financial interest in October of 1982 was not merely a corporate strategy, but a demonstration that institutions can act at their best under conditions of maximum pressure, and that this demonstration has retained its instructive power across 4 decades and through enormous changes in the corporate and regulatory environment. And what the story means, in its deepest and most human register, is that the 7 people who died in the autumn of 1982 mattered, that their lives were of the kind and quality that deserves to be remembered and honored, that the institutions and the laws and the physical protections built in response to their deaths are a form of ongoing tribute to them, and that the continuing openness of the investigation that seeks to account for those deaths is a form of ongoing commitment to the proposition that the accounting of harm is a responsibility that does not expire with time. The bottles on the pharmacy shelves bear their foil seals in silence, and the silence carries within it everything that this story contains: the 7 lives, and the 43 years of investigation, and the transformed regulatory landscape, and the enduring question, and the patient, persistent hope that the question may yet find its answer in whatever light the years still ahead of us may bring. There is a particular quality to the knowledge that an event has changed the world in ways that will never be undone, a quality that belongs to very few events in the full sweep of history. And the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders belong, in their specific and bounded domain, to that category of events. The pharmaceutical industry of 2026 is not the pharmaceutical industry of 1982, and the difference is measurable in the physical and legal and regulatory architecture that surrounds the simple act of reaching for a bottle of pain relief on a pharmacy shelf, an act that millions of people perform every day without awareness of the history that made their safety in that act something that was deliberately built and not merely assumed. The investigators who have worked this case across 4 decades, some of them now retired, and some of them no longer living, gave a significant portion of their professional lives to a question that has not yet yielded its answer, and the quality of that commitment, the willingness to continue working toward a resolution that may or may not come, is itself a form of tribute to the victims and to the obligation that a society incurs when it undertakes to investigate and account for the harms that occur within it. The legal scholars and public health professionals and crisis management experts and packaging engineers and regulatory lawyers who have built their work, in whole or in part, on the lessons of the Tylenol murders have contributed, through their individual and institutional efforts, to a cumulative body of knowledge and practice that has shaped the conditions of safety for an immeasurable number of people. And this cumulative contribution is itself one of the case's most significant and most enduring legacies. The story of the 1982 Chicago Tylenol murders is, in the end, a story about ordinary life and its hidden vulnerabilities, about the human capacity to cause devastating harm through the most ordinary channels, and about the equally human capacity to respond to that harm with the kind of thoroughness and institutional seriousness that turns a disaster into a foundation for something safer and more carefully considered. And so we come, at last, to the end of this long and careful account, having followed the story through all its dimensions and all its decades, from the quiet morning when a 12-year-old girl with a sore throat took a capsule and her parents went about their morning routines, through the weeks of investigation and crisis and institutional response, through the decades of forensic development and legal evolution and cultural transformation, to this present moment in which the sealed bottles sit on their shelves. and the investigation remains open, and the question remains unanswered. And the world that was built in response to the autumn of 1982 continues ordinary and careful and quietly protective around all of us. And here, the long journey through history comes gently to its resting place. The way a river finally reaches the wide and quiet estuary, where it slows and spreads and finds its peace after the long passage through the landscape it has moved through for so many miles. The story of the Tylenol murders is not a story with a tidy ending, not a story that resolves itself in the satisfying way that the human mind desires resolution. And perhaps that is itself the final and most instructive thing it has to offer. The reminder that the world does not always provide the answers, that the weight of its events seems to demand, and that living gracefully with that incompleteness is its own kind of wisdom. Somewhere in the sleeping city of Chicago, and in the quiet suburbs that surround it, the leaves turn, as they always turn when autumn comes, falling in the yards of ordinary houses on ordinary streets, where ordinary people go about their ordinary days, and the pharmacy shelves are stocked and sealed and waiting. And the families of 7 people carry what they carry, and the investigators maintain what they maintain. And the question rests in its long and patient suspension, and the world continues, carefully and imperfectly, and with the particular resilience that human beings bring to the task of continuing in the presence of everything that cannot be resolved, everything that cannot be undone, everything that can only be carried forward, gently, into the quiet and the dark and the slow breathing of another ordinary night. Let the past drift away now, softly, like the last light of an autumn afternoon, like the distant sound of a church bell fading across still water. And let your breathing slow, and let the weight of the world grow light, and rest here, in the knowledge that you are safe, and that the night is long, and that morning, when it comes, will come gently,